After years in prison, an elderly man is released, but when he arrives home, he catches his own grandson treating his daughter cruelly, and he takes a drastic action. Matthew had always been a man guided by strict principles and a protective instinct that was never negotiable. He grew up in the countryside, surrounded by the harshness of the land and daily struggles, where he learned that protecting his own wasn't a choice. It was a duty. He married young to Margaret, a calm and gentle woman who brought peace to the home with her serene nature. With her, he had a daughter, Deborah, who inherited her mother's lightness and her father's steadfastness. Matthew didn't show affection with words, but through his constant presence, with attention and care in everything around him. As Deborah neared adulthood, she suffered something terrible that shattered her innocence and left a mark on the family. Without hesitation, Matthew killed the man responsible with his own hands. He was arrested the same day, refused legal defense, rejected a lawyer, and told the judge he felt no remorse. Sentenced to 23 years, he entered prison with the same firmness that guided him. Silent, but with the look of someone who would never accept harm coming to his loved ones. During the first years in prison, he regularly received visits from Margaret and Deborah. His wife's calm presence brought an unusual peace to that hostile environment. Until one day, Deborah came alone, eyes full of tears. She told him Margaret was sick. Days later, she returned with no spark in her eyes and said her mother had died. Matthew listened in silence, staring at the wall. Margaret was the love of his life, and now she was gone without him even getting to hold her hand. After that, he became even quieter, even more focused. He was respected in prison, not for threats, but for the intensity of his silence and the strength of his presence. Time passed and Deborah kept visiting, even though each meeting brought pain. She shared updates, the start of a relationship, a wedding, then pregnancy. Matthew never met his son-in-law or grandson. Later, Deborah told him her husband had died in an accident and that she was raising their son alone. Matthew just held her hands tightly. He knew what that meant. Over the years, Deborah's face changed. The brightness faded into a contained sadness. She said everything was fine, that her son was rebellious, disobedient, hanging out with bad company. Matthew tried to advise her but felt there was something deeper behind it all. She avoided telling him, maybe trying to protect him. When his sentence ended, Deborah made one last visit. She handed him a paper with the address of her home, said she might not be there when he was released, but wanted to make sure he knew where to go. Matthew held that paper as if it was all that was left in the world. Days later, leaving prison, he passed through the gates with a simple backpack on his back and eyes fixed on the road ahead. He carried nothing else but the name he had built and the address Deborah had given him. He walked the streets as if stepping into a foreign land, though he'd known that ground since childhood. The houses seemed different, the faces meant nothing, even the city's smell felt strange. He was a stranger in his own land. He wondered if there was still room for him there, if his presence made any sense outside the bars. But even with that foggy thought, his feet knew the way. Arriving at his daughter's house, he took a deep breath before knocking on the door. His heart beat steady, not from anxiety, but from the quiet expectation of reuniting with blood of his blood. He knocked once, waited, knocked again. Nothing. No sound, no movement. He walked around to the side of the house. The small wooden gate leading to the backyard was unlocked. He pushed it gently, and as he approached the back door, he saw it was just ajar. He pushed slowly with his palm. The door creaked open softly. At that moment, he heard a voice from the living room. It was loud, uncontrolled, full of anger. His steps became more cautious. He silently moved toward the slightly open door leading to the main room. What he saw there stopped his breath. A tall young man, tense face, eyes burning with fury, was yelling at Deborah. She was curled up on the couch trying to reason. His tone was threatening, full of insults. He gestured aggressively and leaned forward as if ready to attack. "You don't boss me around!" the young man shouted, chest puffed with rage. "I already said no," Deborah replied, trying to stay firm. "Enough, this isn't going to happen anymore." "Then see what happens," the young man yelled, pushing a chair aside brutally. Then he grabbed Deborah by the arms with force and threw her onto the couch. She fell awkwardly, her body trying to shield itself as best she could while he prepared to attack again. Matthew didn't think. Not for a second. His body reacted on its own, as if 23 years of waiting had built up to this moment. He moved with a speed that defied his age. He grabbed the young man's arm firmly and pulled him back, twisting his body and slamming him to the ground with a sharp blow. "What?" the young man tried to say, surprised, but Matthew was already on top of him. He grabbed him by the hair and landed 2 punches, one on each side of the face, hard, dry, direct. The young man's eyes widened from the impact. Deborah screamed, a mix of shock and despair as she recognized her father there in the middle of the room. "Dad, Dad, no!" she begged from across the room. "Please, stop!" But Matthew didn't hear. The old fury took over. The young man tried to get up, but Matthew pushed his knee into his chest, pinning him down with his own weight. He kept hitting the young man's face. He didn't speak, only breathed heavily between each punch. Blood began running from the young man's nose and mouth. Deborah was already crying, curled up, pleading. "Dad, it's Nicholas," she shouted through sobs. "It's my son." Matthew stopped. For a second, everything froze. His fists hung in the air. He looked at the young man's bruised face, his eyes now barely open, body limp, chest gasping. Silence took over. Matthew slowly stood up, still panting, hands trembling. Nicholas spat on the floor, wiping the blood with the back of his hand. He staggered, struggled to stand, glared at his grandfather with hatred and shouted, "You're gonna regret this, old man." He limped out the door, slamming it hard behind him. Deborah, still on the floor, trembled, not from pain, but from something deeper. Her eyes were red, hands shaking, body bent as if wanting to disappear. Matthew stayed still for a few seconds, breathless, chest rising and falling rapidly, trying to process what had just happened. Then he took a deep breath, walked over to his daughter and crouched beside her, saying nothing. She looked at him for a moment, then let her body go limp, sitting cross-legged on the floor, as if giving up, pretending everything was okay. "You didn't know," she said, voice broken, almost a whisper. "I never told anyone. I never had the courage." Matthew said nothing. "He's your grandson," she continued. "It's Nicholas." Matthew sat beside her slowly, still in shock. He didn't know where to put his hands or how to react. He stared at the floor as if trying to rearrange the world inside his head. The name weighed on his chest. The boy from the letters. The son he knew was born, who grew up, now the same, fists clenched against his own mother. Deborah ran her hands over her face, trying to pull herself together. A heavy silence hung between them. Then she took a deep breath and spoke in a faint voice. He's always been difficult, Dad, since he was little. But after his father died, it got worse." Matthew listened silently, eyes down but alert. "It started with lies, then yelling, then cursing. One day he broke my phone because he didn't want me talking to anyone. Another day he locked me in my room. He started going through my things, demanding money. He said he owed dangerous people, but I knew that was a lie." He squinted, holding back anger inside. "He asked me for money every week. When I said I didn't have any, he threatened me. And today was because I said it was over, that I wasn't giving anymore. She rubbed her face hard, trying to hold back tears. I know I messed up. I was too permissive. I tried to make up for his father's absence. I gave too much freedom. I was weak. I tried, Dad. I swear I tried. Matthew broke the silence for the first time since it all happened. He reached out and held her hand, firmly, with presence, with everything he knew how to offer. You didn't fail. He did, he said quietly. Deborah lowered her head, eyes fixed on the floor. I'm ashamed. I never told anyone, not even you. I was afraid of what you'd think, afraid you'd suffer even more. I just survived. In the days that followed, Matthew stayed there. Deborah asked him to. She said she felt safer with him around, and Matthew, even without speaking, understood. He helped with everything. Fixed the door lock, repaired a window, swept the yard. He didn't talk much, but was always present. Deborah began opening up more often. One night, she said quietly while washing dishes, I locked myself in the bathroom and stayed there for hours, just crying, scared to come out. He'd smashed everything in the living room. Matthew looked at her but said nothing. He kept scrubbing the dishes. Sometimes I think he got lost because you weren't around, Deborah continued. He didn't have a male figure, only me. And I tried to be both mom and dad, but maybe it wasn't enough. Another night, sitting on the couch, Deborah said, You know he's hanging out with strange people, right? Sometimes they show up here by the gate. They just stand there, then disappear. I never let them in, but they linger around. Matthew listened to everything. He noted every word. He knew it wasn't over yet. He began sleeping little, spent nights listening for noises. Every shadow felt like a warning. One night, a brick smashed through the kitchen window, shards exploding onto the sink. Deborah screamed, frightened. Matthew ran over. No one was on the street, but on the gate someone had scribbled in red paint, You will pay. The next day, a neighbor called Matthew to the gate and told him, with a worried face, that he'd seen Nicholas the night before. He was with two unknown young men, wandering the street with slow steps and intense looks toward the house. Matthew just nodded silently, thanked, and went inside. He grabbed his wallet and walked to the nearest police station. When it was his turn, he reported the incident clearly. The brick throwing, the threatening graffiti on the gate, the suspicious activity. The clerk listened, took bureaucratic notes, typed info into the system, keeping a neutral expression the whole time. Asked routine questions, requested address, approximate times, names if possible. Matthew answered firmly. He didn't expect immediate action. He knew from the clerk's eyes that the report would end up shelved like so many others. Back home, he observed everything around him. The windows, the corners, the walls. He felt time compressing, as if the threat was about to happen. And so the days went on, in silence, watching, waiting. Peace was no longer possible. It was an illusion about to shatter again. Matthew felt it in his body, felt time tightening around him, as if something was forming in the air, ready to fall. That night, something about the silence felt different. Matthew was in the back bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the half-open door. Deborah had already gone upstairs trying to sleep, but her body wouldn't relax anymore. Since the attack, she spent restless nights, and Matthew knew she only closed her eyes because her father was near. He, in turn, no longer slept well. Sleep was a risk, and risk didn't knock. It broke down the door. Shortly after midnight, a metallic sound outside shattered the silence. Matthew stood immediately. It wasn't a common sound. It was something being kicked or dragged. Footsteps, 3, maybe 4. A low, muffled voice. A short scream. Then the front door burst open violently, banging against the hallway wall. "It's now!" A hoarse voice shouted from outside. Matthew rushed into the living room just as he heard the door slam wide open. 3 figures stormed the house, yelling, kicking chairs, knocking over objects, breaking whatever they saw. One held a broken bottle, another something like a piece of wood. Nicholas came right behind, eyes wide, breathing hard. He was wild, as if hate had taken over every part of his body. "Where are you, old lady?" one accomplice yelled, kicking a piece of furniture. Deborah came halfway down the stairs, frightened by the noise, trying to understand what was happening. When she saw Nicholas come in with 2 men behind, her face lost all color. "No!" she screamed. "Get out of here, Nicholas, please!" He rushed up the last steps. "You still think you run this?" Nicholas shouted. "Today you'll learn." Matthew ran down the hall, but was still far when he heard Deborah's body hit the floor. Nicholas had pushed her with both hands. She fell backward, tumbling down the stairs 3 or 4 awkward turns before hitting the ground hard. The impact was sharp, direct. She moaned, and the sound ignited something in Matthew, not just from anger, but from his very core. He reached the living room and didn't hesitate. The first person he saw was the man with the piece of wood. Without a word, Matthew struck his knee with a sharp blow, dislocating the joint precisely. He felt pain in his back, forcing the move, muscles slow to respond, but he didn't stop. The man fell sideways, screaming in pain, rolling until he hit the table that had already toppled. The second surprise tried to grab Matthew from behind. "How is this old man still standing?" he murmured, not believing what he saw. Matthew twisted his body hard, using the momentum to slam him against the living room wall. The impact was so strong, the man slid to the floor, dazed, struggling to breathe. Matthew himself needed a second longer to regain balance. His body burned, lungs burned, arms ached like rusty metal on a wet day. But he stayed firm. Nicholas came last, eyes even darker than before. But Matthew was already holding the iron bar hidden behind the door. He grabbed it with both hands, breathed deeply despite the fatigue, and just as his grandson leapt at him, he struck with precision. The iron hit Nicholas's face with a sharp, cutting sound. The silence that followed was almost sacred. Nicholas fell to the floor like a dead weight, blood running down the side of his face, pooling on the floor. Matthew didn't move for a few seconds, chest heaving, hands shaking, body screaming in pain, knees weak, joints burning, but he stayed standing. The two accomplices tried to get up, wobbling. One spat on the floor and muttered through his teeth, "That old man's a demon." Neighbors, awakened by the shouting, were already in front of the house. One of them ran inside through the wide-open door. "Someone called the cops!" a woman shouted from the gate. "They're coming." The two injured, disoriented men tried to run, but were held back by two men grabbing them at the exit. One still tried to fight, but fell again, screaming in pain. Deborah lay near the stairs, bleeding from her arm and with a cut on her forehead. She moaned softly, eyes half open, trying to understand if this was reality or nightmare. Matthew dropped the iron bar to the floor with a metallic clatter and ran to her, kneeling beside her with difficulty. His legs trembled, knees ached, touching the ground, but he didn't care. He looked at his daughter's bloodied face, then at her left arm, bent awkwardly, with a bruise rapidly swelling. "It's broken," he said quietly but firmly, touching her arm gently. "Stay still. I'm here." Deborah tried to mumble something but only groaned. Her face was pale, breath short. Matthew supported her head with one hand, brushing the sweat-damp hair aside. He stayed there beside her until he heard the first officer's footsteps entering the door. "Everyone on the floor!" one shouted. Matthew slowly raised the other hand, not moving away from Deborah. He said nothing, just looked at her one more time, eyes wet. It was like everything had returned to that inevitable point. Protect, resist, respond with the body when words weren't enough. "There's an injured woman here," one officer announced, kneeling beside them. "We have 3 suspects contained in the yard," another shouted outside. Nicholas was still unconscious. Officers carefully turned him over and called for immediate medical support. An ambulance arrived minutes later. Paramedics acted fast, placing Deborah and Nicholas on separate stretchers. Matthew held his daughter's hand until the last second, until she was put inside the ambulance. Deborah looked at him before being taken away. "I'm okay," she whispered. "Dad, I'm okay." Matthew only nodded, still silent. When the police approached, he didn't resist. He surrendered willingly. Walked to the patrol car on his own, face steady, body bent under the weight of everything that had happened. Alexander and Joseph, the accomplices, were thrown into the back of another car, still cursing, still limping. At the police station, names were recorded. Matthew, silent, confirmed the facts. The officers already knew who he was, the old man who had served over 20 years for homicide. Nicholas was taken into custody and transported to the hospital, unconscious but stable. Deborah underwent exams and was released after a few hours, still in shock, her arm in a cast after the fracture was confirmed. The investigation quickly revealed what Matthew had already suspected. Alexander and Joseph had extensive criminal records with charges of robbery, assault, and involvement in illegal activities. Nicholas, in turn, was linked to several police reports that had until then been ignored or archived due to lack of direct complaint from his mother. During the trial, Matthew's defense argued self-defense. Deborah took the stand and, with a firm voice, told everything. She spoke about the years of psychological and physical abuse she suffered. She told about the threats, the constant fear, the shove down the stairs. The judge listened silently, taking notes. In the end, the judge recognized the history of abuse, the extreme emotional state, and the protective context in which everything happened. He considered that Matthew had exceeded the limits of self-defense, yes, but not out of malice or criminal intent. The sentence was converted to community service. Matthew heard the decision calmly, without lowering his head. He accepted what came as he had always accepted everything in life, standing, in silence, with dignity. Nicholas was also convicted for trespassing, attempted murder against his own mother, and a series of previous crimes that came to light during the trial. Alexander and Joseph received lesser sentences but were still convicted. All were sent to different prisons. Deborah's house was left destroyed, broken furniture, stained walls, ripped off doors. But what really shattered was the feeling of home that had once held firm inside. She moved to a small, simple apartment in another neighborhood. Took little more than clothes, some books, and her father's letters. She began to live with little, but with peace. Matthew went to live with her. He helped with everything: shopping, doctor visits, organizing the house. He cared for the improvised garden on the balcony and made coffee for her every morning. He did small repairs in the building and volunteered at the neighborhood community center, helping restore used furniture for donation. There was no bitterness or resentment in his actions, only constancy, presence, and a peace earned through effort. In the 2 years that followed, Deborah continued not speaking about Nicholas. She didn't visit him, didn't mention his name. For her, the son she had was lost long before that night. Nicholas remained detained. He attended sessions with psychologists, but in every evaluation the pattern repeated. He blamed the world, blamed his mother, even blamed his grandfather. He never took responsibility. He continued to claim abandonment. Matthew didn't push the subject. He knew Deborah carried scars too deep to be touched. His role now was different, to be there, not with questions, but with presence. 2 years later, on a regular morning, Matthew didn't wake up. He had died in his sleep, a victim of a silent heart attack. He was found lying on his side, as he usually slept, with the serene expression of someone who left nothing unfinished. No letter, No last words, just the silence of one who fulfilled what he believed was his duty. His body was buried with few present: Deborah, a longtime neighbor, and an employee from the community center where he volunteered. At the grave, Deborah left a single flower and a handwritten note with small, firm letters. "Thank you for never leaving me alone." Life went on. Deborah started working as an assistant at a public school. She led a simple, discreet life. She didn't talk about the past, but when asked her full name, she never hesitated. She kept her father's last name with pride. One day, when a co-worker asked about it, she simply replied, "It's the only name I was never ashamed to carry." And so ended Matthew's story. A man who lived and died with the unwavering conviction that protecting his own was the only mission that truly mattered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.